Coming up on the Sarc Fighter podcast.
We're really focused on understanding what's happening in those patients that's allowing them to, have, quote unquote, remission or dramatic improvement, even off therapy. But most patients appear to require ongoing therapy.
The Sarc Fighter podcast brings you one of the top researchers in the country. Dr. William Damsky from Yale University will be talking about how an off-label drug has great success in treating sarcoidosis of the skin.
And so we do think that it, in theory would work for, sarcoidosis of lung and other areas.
My interview with Dr. Damsky is coming up.
This is the Sarc Fighter podcast, living with sarcoidosis and other rare diseases. Here's your host, John Carlin.
Hello and welcome. This is episode 39 of the Sarc Fighter podcast. I am your host, John Carlin. This podcast is brought to you in part by a grant from Atyre Pharma. I do this podcast because I want to offer my fellow Sarc Fighters hope. And I'll tell you quickly, the official Sarc Fighter song is called Zombie by Mark Steyer of Alberta, Canada, who plays in a band called the White Hot Lizards, and he has graciously agreed to allow that to be the official song of the Sarc Fighter podcast. Hear Mark's story and his battle with sarcoidosis coming up in episode 12. And I am fighting Sarc, so are you, whether you're a caregiver, a patient, or like today's guest, a researcher. It's a place where all of us in the sarcoidosis space can gather. I know so many people with Sarc feel like they're alone, and I want to let you know there is a reason for hope. And we'll be talking a lot about hope today because we're looking at a drug that is off-label right now, but is showing a lot of promise in treating sarcoidosis. We release this podcast, I do every other Monday. And, I say we sometimes because there's a lot of people helping me with this behind the scenes in terms of the Foundation for Sarcoidosis Research, feeding me information, feeding me guests, and then those of you who are listening who agree and contact me to come in and tell their story. So that's when I say we, that's what I mean. But otherwise, it's me, but I don't like to say I because I think this is a sort of a collaboration with so many people. But as I'm speaking today, I can tell you that my trusty dog Dougal, the boxer, is curled up at my feet, and I'm enjoying talking to you about how we can all better cope with this affliction called sarcoidosis. So from me and Dougal and everybody else involved, welcome. Now, there are a couple bonus episodes I need you to know about. I recently released 2 bonus episodes, and if you haven't listened, you might enjoy them. One was a town hall hosted by the Foundation for Sarcoidosis Research. They asked me to be the moderator on the topic of prednisone, which most of us know about. In fact, according to their research, 98% of Sarc patients have been on prednisone. And so we had a great panel, Dr. Elliot Krauser from FSR Scientific Advisory Board, Jessica Reed, a neurosarc patient for basically decades, and Dr. Sanjay Shukla of Atyre Pharma, working on another new drug that's showing promise as an alternative to prednisone. And then there was another bonus episode, and this is big right now, with COVID-19. Which vaccine is best for Sarc patients? Is there a threat from any of the vaccines? Can the vaccines cause a sarcoidosis flare-up? And FSR invited Dr. Peter Sporn of Northwestern University with their Sarcoidosis Center of Excellence and Dr. Wonder Drake of Vanderbilt, another researcher, to answer those questions. And once again, they asked me to moderate that conversation, and that hour-long seminar is now available as a bonus podcast here. So those are just things that are sort of ever-present and evergreen, and I thought maybe you needed to know about that. If you're new to the disease and you're trying to figure out, you Googled sarcoidosis and somehow you found the podcast and you're trying to figure out what's going on, listen to episode 2 with Dr. Simon Hart. It's like Sarcoidosis 101, and Dr. Hart from the UK answered all the basic questions about sarcoidosis. And then if you're trying to figure out what I'm all about, I shared my story of neurosarcoidosis on my spinal cord back in episode 1. And then the most recent release prior to this one is with Leo Casimo, who heads up the Sarcoidosis UK. And so if you're listening in the UK or maybe in Europe and you're looking for answers or support, you should check out episode 38. Really enjoyed talking to Leo, and he actually called the Sarc Fighter podcast brilliant. And I love it when people use the word brilliant in association with anything that I've done. So that's just very nice. And Leo it was very gracious. He contacted me and came on and shared the story of Sarc UK. But today it's all about hope. Researchers at Yale University have tried a drug called ZEL-janz to treat patients with sarcoidosis of the skin. And in a couple of cases, in fact, most of their cases, they saw a remarkable recovery to the point where the patient's symptoms actually totally disappeared. And ZEL-janz is one of those drugs that you'll see advertised on television. I see it on the Today Show a lot, morning TV, morning news. A lot of the pharmaceutical companies are pushing their drugs, and ZEL-janz is one that you hear about. And there is another name for it that's more clinical in nature, and I'll let the doctor get into that. But you've heard of it as ZEL-janz, and I'll put a link to it in the show notes. But it's not something that was developed for sarcoidosis, so it's therefore off-label and still in sort of the experimental stage in treating sarcoidosis. But man, it's really, really worked, and they're starting to understand why it worked and how, and maybe more the how of how it works. And that's what we talked about a lot in the interview today. So there is some hope. They don't know yet, but they think maybe that this could work on sarcoidosis and other parts of the body. And Dr. Damsky is a dermatologist. He's a researcher, so he's an Ph.D., but he's also an M.D. He treats patients clinically, and so he's one of those great people that can kind of look at this thing from both sides. So he doesn't just see it work in patients, but then he gets under the microscope and looks in the microscope and he figures out how it's doing its job. And that's what's really, really fascinating, I think. And so we'll be hearing more about that. You will hear him say that more research is needed and they'll need more patients to study, and that's where that Foundation for Sarcoidosis Research Patient Registry can be helpful. If you have not signed up for that, you should, no matter what kind of sarcoidosis you have, and who knows, you might be asked maybe to participate in a clinical trial, maybe the one that could be coming as a result of Dr. Damsky's research. There are some risks involved. There are some side effects, and Dr. Damsky will address those in the interview. But, the thing is that even though he's obviously super smart, let's face it, he's at Yale, and he's a doctor and a researcher, he's very good at describing what's going on in the body of a Sarc patient in a way that the everyday person can understand it. Basically, what we have is a situation in our immune systems where they sense that there is a reason to send all these cellular and molecular defenders to a place in our bodies, our heart, our lungs, you name it, our skin, where there really is no need for it. And the result is these granulomas that then damage the body instead of helping. And that's what an autoimmune response is. And that's what doctors are essentially trying to switch off. And you're going to hear a lot of terms like JAK inhibitor, cytokines, T cells, and all of those can sound kind of scary if you don't have a medical background, but Dr. Damsky will break it all down in layman's terms so it's very understandable. Now, he is just, again, in the beginning of his clinical research on this. He does have a grant from the NIH, the National Institute for Health, which is huge because there's not a lot of NIH funding in the sarcoidosis space so far. So this is the beginning of maybe the breakthrough for sarcoidosis research. And this just really does look really, really promising. So my interview with Dr. William Damsky of Yale University is coming up.
A zombie, just feeding and stumbling.
Hi, I hope you're enjoying the Sarc Fighter podcast. You may be wondering, what can I do to help? How can I be a part of the sarcoidosis solution? It's simple. Make a donation to KISS. Kick in to stop sarcoidosis. 100% of the money goes to the Foundation for Sarcoidosis Research. Look for a link in the show notes of the Sarc Fighter podcast. Welcome back to the Sarc Fighter podcast, and joining me now is Dr. William Damsky, a researcher and a medical doctor at Yale University, with some promising news about sarcoidosis today. Doctor, welcome.
Thank you. Appreciate you having me on today.
So this is great. You've been working in the dermatological arena for some time now, and you've had some success again with a drug that is out there, but it's used to treat something else, and you've applied it to sarcoidosis treatment, dermatological or skin sarc. And what is it that you are working on? Let's get that out there right away, and then we'll kind of dive into it.
Yeah, thanks. So we've mostly been working with a class of medication called Janus kinase inhibitors. We can talk a little bit more about what that means. They're also referred to as JAK inhibitors for short, JAK. And this class of medications has mostly been used for treatment of rheumatoid arthritis, which is a different inflammatory condition, which is unrelated to sarcoidosis. But we've through thinking about what we know about what causes sarcoidosis, we thought that this class of medications might have some potential in treatment of sarcoidosis. And so we've been using it in what's called an off-label setting. So we're using it to treat a condition in which it's not FDA approved for. And we've been treating patients with sarcoidosis. I'm a dermatologist, and so most of our patients have cutaneous or skin involvement of their sarcoidosis. And we've had some, anecdotally, some good luck with this. And so based on that experience, we've been putting together a more comprehensive research program to understand how the medicines might be working, as well as to more thoroughly evaluate their efficacy in this disease.
All right. So the name of the drug, there's a common name, which is only common because we hear about it on television. And so what is the name of the drug and what's the common name?
Yeah, so Xeljanz is the name that you hear on commercials, and the generic name is tofacitinib. So the names of a lot of these drugs are a bit of a mouthful, but that's the medication. That's FDA approved for rheumatoid arthritis. It's been FDA approved for rheumatoid arthritis for a number of years, and there's actually been some more recent FDA approvals for other indications outside of rheumatoid arthritis, but importantly not sarcoidosis at this point.
So I'll circle back with you on how this works in your body, but I've been reading about your treatment of a couple of patients, and they've had almost what I would call like miracle recovery. So what were you able to achieve with this?
Yeah, so, this kind of all started when I was a dermatology resident at Yale in New Haven, Connecticut. And through, my experience as a dermatology resident, I started working with another doctor here who's also a dermatologist, named Brett King, who had a patient that had refractory sarcoidosis. So she had been through a number of treatments that, people with sarcoidosis are familiar with, including prednisone, TNF-alpha inhibitors, methotrexate, hydroxychloroquine, a lot of these medications. And she was primarily concerned about her skin involvement. So she had, sarcoidosis lesions on her face, on her scalp, on other parts of her body, and really just hadn't had a lot of success treating these with other agents. And so this was a time when this class of medications that we just talked about, Janus kinase inhibitors, JAK inhibitors, and specifically the ZEL-janz or tofacitinib drug, was being used to treat a variety of inflammatory disorders in the skin, which were recalcitrant to common therapies. And so together, Dr. King and I treated this patient with sarcoidosis, again, off-label, with this drug, ZEL-janz, tofacitinib. And really, she just had a really dramatic response, such that where she really had failed to have any improvement in her skin lesions with these other medications, after about 6 months of ZEL-janz therapy, everything went away. And, she was a very gracious patient, and, we really enjoyed working with her. And so, through working closely with her, she was very generous in sort of allowing us to do a little bit of investigative work and sort of characterize how the medicine might be working. And the response was so, dramatic, and her improvement was so good. And we had a little bit of, what we call mechanistic data, or how the medicine might be working. We were actually able to publish the results in the New England Journal of Medicine. And that sort of kickstarted this whole area.
Right. So let's talk about her for just a minute. What was, when you get sarcoidosis on your skin, dermatological sarcoidosis, as it were, it's more than just annoying. She had a severe case. So if you were looking at this woman, what would you have seen prior to treatment?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, so as dermatologists, obviously we take inflammatory skin disease very seriously and think of it as more than a cosmetic issue. It's something that affects one's overall being. But sarcoidosis, for those that have skin involvement, it's not uncommon for it to affect the face and the scalp. And so obviously those are very visible areas, and it can be quite devastating to have involvement of sarcoidosis in those areas. And so, for example, she had inflammatory lesions or a skin rash basically on her nose, on her cheeks, on her forehead, on her scalp. The scalp involvement led to hair loss, or what we call alopecia. And so if you can imagine, sort of walking around like this, people think you're contagious. People think that, they're going to catch what you have. They just don't understand. And so it makes things like going to work, going to the supermarket, very, very challenging. And so you can imagine the impact that would have on someone.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, as anybody listening to this knows, sarcoidosis the word spread is wrong, but once you have it in one part of your body, it's not unusual for it to show up in another part of your body. So you can go from your skin to your heart, to your lungs, to your liver, to your in my case, spinal cord. So, you got to get sarcoidosis under control one way or another.
Right. That's absolutely right. And, of course we like to treat skin disease, but we think about, any organ that can be involved, and we look very closely to make sure there are no other organs involved. Skin sarcoidosis, or a specific manifestation of sarcoidosis in the skin, happens in probably about a third of patients that have sarcoidosis. And occasionally it's the only site of involvement, but usually there's other organs involved. And so, we take a very comprehensive approach and work closely with pulmonologists and cardiologists and, doctors of a variety of disciplines in approaching treatment.
Right. So this patient that you had, and folks, Dr. Damsky you are a medical doctor, but you're also a Ph.D. So you're researching as well as treating, and that's a rare bird, and doing this at Yale. So you had success with this woman. Has the success continued over a period of time?
Yeah. So thanks for that question. So, based on that experience with the patient, of course, we wanted to share our results with the medical community. And so we published it, but we also had 3 other patients with refractory cutaneous sarcoidosis, but also involvement of other organs. And based on this experience, we had a comprehensive discussion with patients, and we, explained what we were seeing with this one patient, and we explained the risks of the medication, which, I'd be happy to talk about. These 3 other patients were also willing to undertake treatment. And, patients had long-standing disease, in some cases, 20 plus years, really without, adequate control from their point of view and from our point of view. And those patients also were treated off-label with this medication, really just had really remarkable responses as well.
So how many patients are we talking about now after your initial patient?
Yeah, so initial patient and then 3 additional patients.
Okay.
And that at that point, we felt like really we were onto something. So a total of 4 patients. And at that point, we actually applied for funding from Pfizer. So Pfizer is the manufacturer of ZEL-janz. And we, shared with them what we're seeing in these patients. And we also shared with them, what just a huge need there is for more effective, safer treatments without side effects. And we asked if they'd be willing to support us in what we call sort of a proof of concept, or a small open label trial. So all the patients get the medication to treat an additional 10 patients with sarcoidosis. And so that trial has been completed, and we're in the process of publishing the results. We presented some of the data describing those results at a dermatology conference, but the full results have yet to be published. And I'd be happy to share, sort of what we observed during that trial. But so it was those initial 4 patients that kind of, again, really let us think that we're onto something that led to this 10-patient clinical trial. And now, of course, we're thinking beyond that.
Okay, well, that is amazing. So if somebody is listening to this and they have dermatological sarcoidosis, are you seeking people to participate in this bigger trial?
Yeah, so we're still working out the details and the mechanism support and exactly which drug it will be, but it will be a drug in this class of, JAK or Janus kinase inhibitors. But, the details aren't evident yet. As you can imagine, this requires a lot of buy-in from pharmaceutical companies that make the drug. And so we're working through those details now, but we're optimistic that we'll have something in the next year or so, and at which time we will be looking for participants.
Okay, gotcha. So let's talk about how this works in the body. So people have heard of ZEL-janz because they advertise, Pfizer advertises on television. So it's the classic, I wasn't doing too well. And then my doctor told me about ZEL-janz and and then you see, the woman playing with her daughter or what, I can't remember which commercial it is, but you see it quite often, flying a kite. And then you hear all the disclaimers about all the potential side effects. We'll get to that in a minute. But what made you think that ZEL-janz would help Sarc patients? What's happening in the body at the cellular level or molecular level that made you as a brilliant researcher say, this might help sarcoidosis?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I mean, this is really just a key question. And yeah, we can talk about the potential side effects, but, sarcoidosis is a disease that we believe involves the body's immune system. So your immune system normally protects you from infections from bacteria and viruses and other organisms. And in patients with sarcoidosis, the immune system works just fine, but it, we think, is fighting an infection that it thinks is there, but is not there. And so that is true not only of sarcoidosis, but a variety of autoimmune diseases, which we kind of think of sarcoidosis as. And so, when we got into this, and we discussed that initial patient where we looked at this, we saw this really dramatic response. We really hit the books at this point, and started looking for different, research that had been done in the past that told us about the specific signals or cues or proteins that the body uses to fight infection, but that are also maybe overexpressed or produced at increased levels in sarcoidosis, maybe when they shouldn't be. And we realized that a lot of the proteins that do this, which are called cytokines. So cytokines are proteins that your body's immune system makes to fight infection, but are also important in autoimmune diseases. A lot of these, quote unquote, cytokines that the body's immune system was making in sarcoidosis use this set of instructions that the body has called the JAK-STAT pathway. So it's a bit of a mouthful. It's an abbreviation. Janus kinase is JAK, and signal transducer and activator of transcription is STAT. But it's basically a set of blueprints. And so the body uses this set of blueprints to respond to these cytokine proteins that the immune system produces. And we noticed that a lot of these cytokines that people had described as being dysregulated or overexpressed or produce increased levels in sarcoidosis use this set of blueprints. And so the neat part about this class of medications is that it blocks those blueprints. And so we thought that even if we didn't know, the one most important cytokine or protein that was driving this disease, it would in a lot of ways cover a bunch of them that are likely to be involved. And so for that reason, we thought that it was likely that this medicine could work in this disease. And a lot of our research interest is in really drilling down on trying to find what is the key specific molecule or cytokine that the body is targeting. I'll just say really quickly that something that some listeners may be familiar with is something called TNF-alpha. So TNF alpha is an example of one of these cytokines, and it's blocked by medications like Remicade, which, goes by infliximab, or Humira, which goes by adalimumab. And, folks probably also are aware that these medications are used also off-label to treat sarcoidosis in a variety of settings. And so those medications are examples of drugs or medications that block one specific cytokine. This Janus kinase inhibitor class of medications blocks a number of cytokines. And so for that reason, we thought, in the context of the success we'd had with the medication, it's likely that, it makes sense that it would work.
When you explain it that way, it seems like such a no-brainer. It feels like you've proved it, and I know the answer is much more complicated, but it's frustrating to me to hear that it's going to be years before, if this works as well as it sounds like it does and is working for obvious reasons by blocking the cytokines, it seems like it ought to just be available and not off-label, because now you got to fight with an insurance company who says, well, that's not for sarcoidosis, right? For instance, when listeners know, I take Humira, which is off-label, and I did take Remicade until I had issues with liver enzymes, but that was working. But Humira is related, and it doesn't cause that, so that's I guess why that's working. So this probably is sounding very familiar to a lot of Sarc patients. So now you've got something that's blocking in Zeljanz a bunch of different cytokines. That's fantastic. And it's, you're working with dermatological, but there's no reason why this wouldn't work for sarcoidosis in other parts of the body, is there?
Yeah, that's correct. And that we think that's correct. That's a question we're really interested in addressing through our research. And so most, as a dermatologist, most of our focus has been in skin, because that's sort of our, our comfort zone and what we're used to following and evaluating. But we have undertaken some research projects to look for these same signals in sarcoidosis in the lung and the lymph nodes. In that signaling pathway does seem to be conserved. And so we've meaning that it's also present in these other areas. And so we do think that it, in theory would work for, sarcoidosis of lung and other areas. One of the things that we're evaluating now with our clinical trial is, although all of our patients have, involvements in their skin, we've also been following them for how their internal organ involvement, whether it's lungs, whether it's bone, whether it's heart, whether it's, liver or somewhere else, following how that does on treatment. And so we hope to, have a pretty good sense of, at least, in a small 10 patients or proof of concept study, that there does seem to be some activity, meaning that Zeljanz is effective in treating skin as well as internal organs. But it's really sort of a key question for us, is, how does the skin do, but how do other areas do? And one of the reports that we have published already, which is just a case report, meaning it's a single patient, and it's sort of just an observation. The patient was treated with Xeljanz, and this is what we saw. She had sarcoidosis for greater than 25 years, and she had it in her skin, in her lungs, in her bone, in all areas seemed to respond. And so, medicine isn't based on a single patient, but certainly it's optimistic news. And so we hope to really understand that more fully as we move forward.
Well, this, I don't want to use the word cure, because, I don't think we're ever going to be able to use the word cure and sarcoidosis in the same sentence, but certainly effective treatment has got to be, this sounds so promising. It's wonderful.
Yeah. You do raise an important point of cure versus treatment. And so it's a question that we don't have an answer to, but I should say that we think of this as a treatment as opposed to a cure. And so, again, we're working with a small number of patients. And so our experience really is more anecdotal. It's not really a, controlled clinical trial. But we have seen that in most patients, when they stop the medication, the sarcoidosis seems to come back. So we're thinking of this as more of a treatment. as some of your listeners may know, occasionally, although not as commonly as we'd like, sarcoidosis can sort of go away on its own over time or spontaneously regress. And so for that reason, this is one of our really main focuses in terms of research is how does treatment with ZEL-janz or some other medicine in this class fundamentally alter the body's immune response in this setting? And so is there any reason to think that sarcoidosis could that this treatment could alter the natural history of this disease? In most patients, it does not seem to, but we've had a couple patients that have been able to come off treatment and remain better even off treatment. And so we're really focused on understanding what's happening in those patients that's allowing them to have quote unquote remission or dramatic improvement even off therapy. But most patients appear to require ongoing therapy.
So let's talk about the side effects then. If you take ZEL-janz for too long, can there be other problems that are greater than sarcoidosis?
Yeah. So, whenever any patient with sarcoidosis or with other, dermatologic disease is thinking about taking this medication, it's usually in the setting of having something that just really profoundly alters their life in a negative way. And they've usually failed a number of other treatments. And so, that's one side. The other side is, as you mentioned, we don't want to cause something that's worse than disease. So, it's really, we've been approaching this on a case-by-case basis. Every patient's different, patients' motivations for treatment are different. It's a very personal decision. And so really we outline what is known about the safety of this class of medications and the potential benefit of taking them. And so the main side effects or potential adverse effects that we tell patients about really are similar to a lot of medications that sarcoidosis patients are treated with, prednisone, TNF-alpha inhibitors, methotrexate. The nice difference between Xeljanz or this class of medications and prednisone, which a lot of patients probably know well, is that it doesn't have a lot of the metabolic side effects. So, diabetes, hypertension, patients really know these potential side effects well. Prednisone sort of in a unique class by itself and has this whole other suite of, osteoporosis, ulcers of potential side effects. This medication tends not to have those side effects, but it does have potentially, significant adverse effects, which include infection. And so methotrexate, TNF-alpha blockers, this medicine, infection is always a concern. And so our patients are screened for tuberculosis and hepatitis before we start the medication. If they are to get sick, nowadays, particularly relevant with COVID, they stop the medication and they wait till they recover before they start it. In contrast to biologic medications like Humira, which are injected, this is a pill that's taken by mouth. And so what's called the half-life of the medicine, or the amount of time the medicine is active, is relatively short. And so one of sort of the parts that we like about it is that if you were to stop taking the medication, for example, you get the flu, God forbid you get COVID, you stop the medication, the effect is gone within a day. Whereas, biologics are sort of on board for a long time, the injected medications, but certainly infection's a concern. And with this particular class of medications, it seems to have an especially increased risk of shingles and herpes reactivation. But in most patients isn't really a major issue. So that's the infection piece. I think the main issue that needs to be worked out with this class of medications is what we call hypercoagulability, or the propensity to form a blood clot. Data looking back at ZEL-janz as well as other medications in this class suggests that very, very rarely, like really very rarely, but a real risk, patients may develop a blood clot, which could have serious consequences. We don't understand why some patients develop that. But it's something we talk carefully about with patients. And so if they have a history of, for example, smoking, which also predisposes you to blood clots, may not be a good candidate. If they have a history of a blood clot, may not be a good candidate. And so that's a consideration. Those are probably the main things we talk to about patients. We talk with patients about before we start the medication. Like any medication, there's a variety of sort of really, really rare side effects that, may not be significant necessarily, that we also cover with them. Right. So it's really a discussion of risk benefit.
So you've, going back to your research to date, you published in the New England Journal of Medicine. Congratulations. I know that's a huge, big deal. And so now it's out there, but for people who are listening, who are going to medical centers all over the United States, is the medical community largely aware of your success, or is it just sort of seeping out and doctors here and there know about it?
I think probably more the latter at this point in time, but we have presented our research at a number of, international medical conferences. So we try to get out the word in that way. We have about 6 publications in this area. So we've tried to get the word out that way. And that also helps, just practically with insurance coverage. If a doctor is trying to get you this medicine off label, if you're a candidate for it, you can, put these references in there and have some hope of potentially getting it covered. We have a paper under consideration now, which is at a very good journal, and it's one that's describing the results of our 10-patient open-label clinical trial. So our hope is that will ultimately be accepted in a journal where it will be, widely visible to the medical community, and we hope at that point, it will get attention. But ultimately, a lot of doctors, and this is not right or wrong, but if it's not FDA approved for the indication, it may not necessarily be used. And so our goal is, if this general approach continues to be as promising as we think it is, to design those pivotal studies, which will, allow the FDA to evaluate whether or not there's efficacy sufficient for approval. So that's really our goal.
Gotcha. So now you've got an NIH grant. So you've obviously gotten the attention of some people who can really help you make a difference. So congratulations on that. So it's about what, $750,000?
Yeah. So it's a 5-year grant. It's what's called a K08 grant. That's the technical term for it. It's a career development grant. So the NIH is basically giving me money to, further develop my expertise in this area, further develop the concept, and, further develop the approach that we'd be using. And so a lot of the money from that grant will be using to look at samples from patients that were graciously provided that participated in our clinical trial, to really try to understand how is the medicine working. If it works better in some patients than others, why is that? And so we hope to really take a deep dive into sort of what we call the immunology of sarcoidosis in the setting of this treatment, and understand how it's working.
So what is your timeline on that? I assume you're at the very beginning, or you're just trying to figure out how to start, or where to start, or what happens next? Yeah.
So it's a really good question. So doing experiments with the latest technologies is really, really expensive. It's just really, really expensive, and the money has to come from somewhere, and usually it comes from grants. And so we've been able to use some fairly sophisticated methods of just really understanding sarcoidosis at a level that it just hasn't been evaluated before, using these newer techniques. And we've done that with a small number of patients, a lot of whom participated in our clinical trial. And as I mentioned, we're in the process of sharing not only our efficacy data, so how well does Zeljanz work in this population, but also how we think it's working. So that's something that's sort of been done on a limited scale, and we have a hypothesis. So we have an idea of how it's working. Really what the NIH grant will allow us to do is to really spread our wings and evaluate this across, a large number of patients with sarcoidosis, and think about, how and what proportion of patients are these signals shared, and what proportion of patients would we predict that this medication would work, How do we think it's working? So it really will allow us to sort of, open up and just study a larger number of patients.
This just sounds so promising. Just the way that it works and the fact that it will block a bunch of proteins instead of just maybe one protein. Do you think we're close to figuring out what causes sarcoidosis? Can you sort of back it out from where you are and say, well, if this is happening, this is what's causing it, and then even get back to whatever the trigger is for sarcoidosis?
Yeah, gosh, yeah, it's such a good question, and I hope my answer will in some way answer it. But the why question is always the hardest one for us to answer, and it's always the one that patients want to know. And if I had sarcoidosis, I would want to know why too. It's really, really hard to answer, but the general paradigm under which we put sarcoidosis, other autoimmune diseases, is that it's a combination of your genetics, so your DNA, the genes that you inherited from your parents. There may be some tendency to develop sarcoidosis, so that's one part. Your environment, so people have described different things in the environment that may trigger sarcoidosis. You're probably aware, folks that responded to 9/11, unfortunately have experienced sarcoidosis-like illness. So there's clearly something in the environment that can drive it. And probably the last part of it really is bad luck. Not to sound, whatever, crass or whatever, but it really, there's something we don't understand about why it happens in certain people and not others. And from a genetic standpoint, the example that we commonly use is identical twins. So they have the same DNA. They're often in the same environment, at least early in life. And sometimes one develops the disease and the other doesn't. And so it really suggests that there's something random or stochastic or luck-based about it. But we are interested in sort of answering that why question, but I don't really have a great satisfying answer at this point in time. But what we do, at least in terms of treatment, what we really are interested in understanding is sort of the how part of things. So why is hard, how we can answer. So all the techniques that we use in the lab help us answer the how question. So what specific proteins, what specific cytokines, how is therapy altering those cytokines to lead to this, ultimate manifestation of sarcoidosis. And so in the short term, that's the question we hope to answer as a very practical, matter of fact, we're treating it, we think we're hitting this is why it's working or not working. The how question is tough, but one we're really, really interested in, but the insight may be longer in terms of timescale.
I've interviewed a number of people, and actually include myself in this category, who had a small rash, say, around their ankles that kind of looked like bug bites. And that, in hindsight, turns out to have been the onset of sarcoidosis, which showed up someplace else in the body. Can you explain that? Why would it start out with a rash around someone's ankles and then wind up in their spinal cord or their lungs or their heart?
Yeah, it's a really fascinating question. I don't know. And I think medicine as a field doesn't know, but I think that there is some evidence to suggest that there is some environmental thing, whether it's a bug bite, whether it's a medication, whether it's, breathing something in. Something seems to set the wheels in motion on this process. And whether that's the same for every patient, whether it's different for every patient, really isn't particularly well understood.
Right.
But there's, something happens to set this off. Either it's an environmental exposure or it's just, things happening in the body. It's that moment when that, quote unquote, bad luck happens and something triggers this response.
Yeah. And sometimes I can't figure out, and again, I'm asking you a why question. So
the why questions are the most interesting.
Yeah. But why would it show up on your face as opposed to in your lungs? Why, if it's going to show up, why doesn't it always show up in the same place?
Yeah, really great question. And as dermatologists, this is a question that we just is so fascinating, but we just don't have answers for. So some rashes like sarcoidosis, they have a propensity for the face. Other rashes like psoriasis have a propensity for your elbows and knees. Really why that is very, very poorly understood. It may relate to a number of things, like, for example, what types of bacteria, which are normal on everybody, live on that part of the skin, or what the temperature of the skin is, or whether there's trauma there, or, minor trauma, or, just flexing or not. It's really not well understood. I wish we had a reason to explain it, but for your point about why skin versus lungs versus heart versus somewhere else, we study a different disorder in the skin called granuloma annulare. So again, all these terms are just a real mouthful, but the reason that I mention it is that granuloma annulare can look a lot like sarcoidosis on the skin. It looks different when we biopsy under the microscope, but under the skin it looks the same. But granuloma annulare never involves the internal organs. Like, literally, it just never involves the internal organs, whereas we know sarcoidosis commonly involves the internal organs. So we think that that condition, granuloma annulare versus sarcoidosis, may involve a different type of T cell. So T cells are part of your immune system, and they're kind of the boss, or the generals. If you think of your immune system as an army, they tell everybody where to go and what to do. They recognize invaders like bacteria and viruses, and they tell everybody where the enemy is and what to do, and they help out themselves. Our hypothesis is that it's a different kind of T cell, one that can go into the skin as well as other organs, that's important in sarcoidosis, whereas this other condition, granuloma annulare, is more a problem of T cells that just live in the skin. But really the details of that remain to be, fully worked out. But that's our idea.
You could spend 50 years on this and be successful and never have all the answers.
It's true. It's true.
Right?
It's true. It's true. It's true. But it's fascinating to think about, and it's practically important, because we think that it will help us treat our patients better, which is the ultimate goal. But you're right. Science tends to progress in, a lot of very small steps. Sometimes there's contradicting results and you take a step back. But that base of knowledge in the right setting really can lead to a giant leap forward. And so, the goal is to just, really be diligent in accumulating as much data as you can, even at small intervals of improvement, just to, whether it's, our group or whether it's a group on the other side of the world, to have that data there to just really allow that transformative advance.
And we're speaking here in June of 2021, and who knows, somebody maybe 2 years from now listening to what will then be a back episode of this. But so you are in the formative stages. The Foundation for Sarcoidosis Research, I know one of the things they do is help recruit patients. So you will be seeking people with Sarc on their skin to participate in your trial at some point, right?
That's correct. Yeah. FSR is really just amazing. And it's been so great to interact with the folks there. And, even with the clinical trial that we just completed, they were very helpful in, using the patient registry, which is just really a phenomenal resource to help us find patients to participate in our study, the past study. Once we have the details worked out, which hopefully will be sometime soon for the follow-up larger study, yes, we also will be seeking patients, and certainly patients with skin involvement will be folks that we're interested in enrolling. We hope to also be able to expand it out to folks without skin involvement as well. But that remains to be determined. And, it just, when I got into this, it just seemed so simple. You have this drug, you feel like it's working, like, let's just do it. But, in a very, cautious and, whatever way, but let's get going here. But it just, from the, pharmaceutical end, there's a lot of moving parts, and it's just been immensely more complex to put the pieces into place to make this happen than I could have ever expected. That being said, we are, really, really pushing this, and we hope to make it happen soon.
Well, that's great. And so you've got support from Pfizer, you've got support from the federal government, you've got FSR in your corner. Of course, you're at Yale, which has, I would assume, an immense amount of resources. So you're the right guy in the right place, it sounds like.
Yeah, thanks for saying that. Yeah, we're really excited about this. And so, yeah, thank you.
All right. Well, we wish you all the best. And of course, you can contact me anytime you want. If you need me to help you reach out to the audience for people who want to participate, or if you want to share the results, we'd love for you to do it here on the Sarc Fighter podcast.
Sure. Thanks. Yeah. Thanks so much for having me today and for the offer. It's been a lot of fun. And we'll once we've reached the next step, we'll be sure to let you know.
All right. Dr. William Damsky, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
I feel like a zombie, just feeding and stumbling.
I am so grateful to be able to bring you people of this quality here on the Sarc Fighter podcast. Now, we already have, of course, the wonderful stories from my fellow Sarc patients. And now, thanks to the Foundation for Sarcoidosis Research, I have connections to people like Dr. Damsky and others coming up soon, and some others we've already had on the show. So more people know what's going on and understand how our bodies are reacting to this autoimmune response, and perhaps the drugs that can help. This is really a whole new field as we look for something other than prednisone to treat sarcoidosis, methotrexate, and the menu of drugs that all of us have seen our doctors sort of go through and look for the one that works. And so maybe soon all the drugs used to treat sarcoidosis won't be off-label, and your doctor will have more choices as they try to find a way to get you in remission with whatever type of sarcoidosis you may be struggling with if you're listening to the Sarc Fighter podcast. Now, please don't forget to go back and listen to the bonus episodes on sarcoidosis and COVID-19, and also dealing with prednisone. Those were rare opportunities to have all the right people in the room at the same time, and you really get solid answers and not just suppositions or other people offering anecdotal information. I mean, that's interesting to listen to, but if you really want the right answers, you have to get it from the right researchers, and in those bonus episodes, you get that. Please send me an email in the show notes. Follow The Sarc Fighter on Instagram and Sarc Fighter on Facebook. I do appreciate your interest in the Sarc Fighter podcast. It helps reach more people and grow the show if you share it on your social media, so please do that. And if you like it, really, just tell one person. Just tell one person, hey, have you heard about the Sarc Fighter podcast? They've got all the right stuff on there. And give the show a nice review on whatever app you use to download your podcasts. Thanks again to Dr. William Damsky for joining me here today. Let's hope his research finds continued success. And until next time, keep fighting.
Learn to suffer, you feel